The numbers get smaller, the hits get bigger. And here's the week's biggest debut. It's by 21-year-old Rick Astley from Lancashire, England. It's his first chart single, and it recently hit #1 on the dance chart. Leaping up our pop chart to number 34, Rick Astley and Never Gonna Give You Up.
We're no strangers to love. American Top 40.
These are the hits that left an impact, the high-powered Top 100 of 1988. Next is a singer who is able to launch his career with government help. In England, there's a program called the British Enterprise Allowance Scheme. It's designed to help people start their own business. Now, this enterprising English lad borrowed money from his dad, got the matching fund from the government to put together a demo tape. It led him to international success. He ends the year as Billboard's #1 artist overall on the dance club chart. He's Rick Astley with the song at number 4, Never Gonna Give You Up.
You know the rules, and so do I.
Casey's Top 40.
You're listening to Casey's Top 40, coming to you from Hollywood. Well, now we're up to our story about the red-headed British singer-songwriter who got signed to a record deal and then spent the next 10 months in the studio, not as a recording artist, but as the English equivalent of a gopher, a T-boy. It's true that other artists have started off as T-boys, most notably Alan Parsons of the Alan Parsons Project, who was a T-boy at the famed Abbey Road Studios. But Rick's the only artist who became a T-boy after he got a record deal. He was so young, so new to the music business, and so unaffected by his signing that he agreed to spend almost a year as a T-boy while he prepared for his first album. And since Rick was signed by one of the hottest British production teams in the business, Stock, Aitken Waterman, he had to fix tea for the trio's other artists, including Bananarama, Dead or Alive, and Samantha Fox. He was even on hand when Paul McCartney, Boy George, and Mark Knopfler joined together to re-record Let It Be to raise money for victims of the British ferry disaster in 1987. Rick sang on that track, but what he remembers is, quote, "There was a lot of tea made that day, and he was the one making it." Now, most artists wouldn't agree to make tea for other artists after they just signed a big contract, but Rick is such an easygoing fella that he thinks the whole experience was great. And even after 4 top 40 records, Rick's willing to make tea for just about anybody who'd like a cup. Moving up 6 notches to number 12, here's friendly Rick Astley with She Wants to Dance With Me.
She wants to dance. Hit me. The hits with the shadow.
Rick says Stock, Aitken Waterman did some great stuff for me, but they've got a formula. I just felt that their stuff was becoming too similar. They make their music the way they make it, and I don't want them to change it for me. Well, Rick Astley calls his new album Free. It's a mix of slow and up-tempo stuff. He picked this ballad as his first single so the people would notice, hey, he's a versatile guy. Up 5 to number 11 this week, this is Cry for Help.
Casey's biggest hits.
4 years ago this week, one of the biggest hits in the USA was by Rick Astley, a singer whose musical career began when he was left alone in a room during a mix-up at school. Rick grew up in a small English town. His family had no interest in music. There wasn't an instrument in the house, not even a record player. And Rick might never have turned to music if his family hadn't moved when he was 8 years old. You see, Rick arrived at his new school before his papers did. And until his school could figure out what to do with him, he was placed all alone in a classroom. Rick was bored, but then he saw a set of drums in the corner and started to play them. He had fun, and he says that's what sparked his interest in music, an interest that led to one of the biggest hits in the USA 4 years ago this week. Here's Rick Astley and She Wants to Dance With Me.
Casey's biggest hits.
5 years ago this week, one of the biggest hits in the USA was Never Gonna Give You Up by a singer who had to audition in person for his record company because they just didn't believe it was really him on his demo tape. At the time, Rick was a teenager working as a gopher in a recording studio. After hours, he cut a demo tape to showcase his unique voice. And through an agent, he started sending the tape around along with a photo of himself. One of the tapes went to RCA Records. They listened, and they liked it a lot. But when they looked at the photograph, they thought something was wrong. There was no way that that young boy in the photograph could have such a mature voice. And so to prove he could really sing, Rick Astley had to go to RCA and do an audition in person. That convinced them, and soon after, they signed Rick. The result, Rick's first hit was one of the biggest hits in the USA 5 years ago this week. Here's Never Gonna Give You Up.
I just wanna gonna tell you how I'm feeling. Gotta make you understand.
Casey's Top 40.
Well, now we're up to the current hit for Rick Astley, a British singing star who once lived through every musician's worst nightmare. It happened back in 1988 when he was enjoying the success of 3 hits from his debut album, Never Gonna Give You Up, Together Forever, and It Would Take a Strong, Strong Man. To quickly follow up that success, he was in the studio feverishly working on his second album. After he'd completed 6 songs, more than half the album, he decided to take a short break to recharge his creative batteries, and he left town. Well, while he was away, disaster struck. A massive fire gutted the London studio where he'd been working, and all his master tapes, all the work that he'd done, went up in flames. The young singer was devastated, but he had one ray of hope. It turned out that since he'd been recording on a digital system, there was a digital backup of some parts of his tracks. There weren't any complete songs, and the quality wasn't good enough to use on the album, but that backup gave him a place to begin again. With grim resolve, the young singer and his producer went back into the studio to try and recreate the spontaneity and excitement of their lost work. And when they were done, they had an album that gave him 3 more hits. These days, Rick Astley's success continues with a song that's spending its 3rd week at number 1 on the Adult Contemporary chart. Here on the Pop Chart, it's survey song number 32. On Casey's Top 40, this is Rick Astley and Hopelessly.
Casey's biggest hits.
7 years ago this week, back in 1988, one of the biggest hits in the USA was Never Gonna Give You Up, by a singer who was performing at a family summer camp by the English shore when he heard he finally had a chart record. Like a lot of struggling British singers, Rick Astley performed where and when he could, in everything from clubs he described as smaller than most living rooms to rec halls at Britain's famous Butlins family camps. And it was while he was singing at one of those camps, for an audience that Rick says usually didn't pay a lot of attention to his music, that he got a call that his first single had hit the British charts, and he was needed back in London to start making appearances at some really big clubs. 7 years ago this week, the song that started Rick's career was one of the biggest hits in the USA. Here's Rick Astley with Never Gonna Give You Up.
Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down, never gonna run around and desert you, never gonna make you cry, never gonna say goodbye, never gonna tell a lie and hurt you.
Casey's biggest hits.
8 years ago this week, back in 1988, one of the biggest hits in the USA was by a singer who says his first demo tape sounded just awful. The problem was his voice was too big and the studio was too small. Rick Astley is a modest-looking lad with a voice that's the human equivalent of a mighty Wurlitzer organ. It fills a whole room. And when Rick and his big voice tried recording a demo in a small, low-rent studio, the equipment just couldn't handle it. There was distortion all over the place. Rick says that first demo was pretty bad, but it was good enough to impress the producing team of Mike Stock, Matt Aitken, and Pete Waterman. They spent months trying to train that big voice, and 8 years ago this week, they unleashed it on one of the biggest hits in the USA. Here's Rick Astley with Together Forever as the countdown rolls on.
Countdown.